He walked into a pawn shop to sell his wedding ring. Not because he wanted to, but because his daughter needed to eat. 32 years old. An aerospace engineer who once calculated trajectories for satellites now couldn't calculate how to keep the lights on. Ethan Carter stood at that counter with $3 in his wallet, a fever-sick child at home, and the one thing he swore he'd never sell pressed cold against his palm. He didn't know someone was watching. He didn't know that the worst moment of his life was about to become the first page of something neither of them could have written. If this story already has you, hit that like button, drop your city in the comments, and let's see just how far this reaches. The November wind off Lake Michigan had a particular cruelty to it, the kind that didn't just cut through your coat but found the gaps between your ribs and settled there, cold and permanent. Ethan Carter felt it the whole 6 blocks from the bus stop to the pawn shop on West Madison. His shoulders drawn in against the weather, his hands shoved deep in the pockets of a jacket that was 2 winters too thin. He walked slowly. He'd been walking slowly all morning. It wasn't the cold slowing him down. He'd grown up in Chicago winters. He could handle cold. What he couldn't handle, what kept making his feet drag and his jaw tighten, was the weight of what was sitting in his right jacket pocket. Not heavy in any physical sense. The ring barely registered on a scale. But he'd been carrying it for 3 blocks now, and it felt like a stone tied around his neck, something pulling him down toward the sidewalk, toward the great-covered storefronts and the gray slush collecting against the curbs. Goldstein's Pawn and Exchange sat between a check-cashing place and a shuttered cell phone repair shop. The sign in the window was hand-painted, yellow letters on black, and the glass was so thick with condensation that Ethan could barely make out the shapes of the items inside. Guitars, power tools, watches laid out on velvet. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at his own reflection in the glass. The man looking back at him was someone he recognized but wouldn't have claimed 3 years ago. The jaw was the same, the height was the same, but the face was different in ways that had nothing to do with age. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't come from laughing. The shoulders carried something invisible and exhausting. He pulled the door open. The bell above the door gave a dull, flat clang. The spring mechanism was worn out, barely working. Inside, the shop smelled like metal polish and old carpet, with an undertone of something else, something harder to name. The smell of things that used to belong to someone. The smell of history selling itself off, one piece at a time. Behind the glass counter, a heavy-set man in a flannel shirt glanced up from his phone. His name was Frank Goldstein. 3rd generation, his grandfather had started this place in 1962. And he had the particular expression of someone who spent his working life watching people come in under pressure. Not unkind, just precise. He'd learned long ago that sympathy didn't close a transaction. "Help you?" Frank said. Ethan walked to the counter. He reached into his pocket and set the ring on the glass. It was a simple gold band, not extravagant. He and Maya had bought it at a small jewelry store on Michigan Avenue during the year they were both working, her as a nurse, him as a junior engineer, when they thought the future was a straight line in front of them. He'd paid $640 for it. He remembered the exact number because he'd saved for 4 months, buying generic groceries and packing lunch every day and turning down happy hour drinks with his coworkers. And when he'd finally counted the money in the envelope at the kitchen table, he'd been $90 short, and Maya had laughed and said it didn't matter. She'd already been engaged to him for 6 years in her heart. But he'd waited the extra 3 weeks anyway because he wanted to do it right. He'd worn it for 7 years. He hadn't taken it off once, not even when Maya got sick, not even through the hospital stays, and the last year and the funeral, not even through the 2 years after, when everything fell apart financially. He'd kept it on like it was the last physical fact of a life he'd built and lost. He kept his hand on the counter when he set it down, his fingers not quite releasing it yet. Frank leaned forward and picked up the ring with practiced fingers. He turned it under the overhead light, checked the inside for a hallmark, set it on a small digital scale. 10-karat gold, Frank said. 4.2 grams. He tapped something on a calculator beside the register. I can do 85. Ethan said nothing for a moment. Current gold rate, Frank added, not defensively, just explaining. That's a fair number. $85. Ethan had known it would be something like that. He'd looked up gold prices on the library computer 2 days ago, done the math himself. He'd known. But knowing a number and hearing it spoken out loud were different things, and for a second the floor under him felt slightly uncertain, like something structural had shifted. "Okay," Ethan said. He heard the door open behind him. The broken bell gave its flat, tired sound. A rush of cold air moved through the shop. He didn't turn around. "If you have any other items," Frank said, moving toward the register. "Jewelry, electronics, tools." "I don't," Ethan said. "Just the ring." Frank nodded and started pulling up the paperwork. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, and the shop was quiet. Outside, a city bus rumbled past. Somewhere in the back, a radio played something with a lot of static. Ethan stared at the ring sitting on the glass counter and thought about Sophie. Sophie was 6 years old, and she had her mother's eyes, that particular shade of dark brown that could look black in certain light. And she had a way of laughing at something before she understood it was funny, her brain already half a step ahead of the joke. She was also, at this exact moment, at home in their apartment on North Sawyer with a fever of 101, 2 and a cough that had been worsening for 5 days. Their neighbor Mrs. Kowalski was sitting with her, watching afternoon television and making chicken broth from a powder packet, because Mrs. Kowalski was 74 years old and barely had the energy for her own problems, but had never once turned Ethan away when he needed her. The pediatrician, the one their insurance used to cover, had said the cough could be the beginning of a chest infection. Could be nothing. Hard to tell without a proper examination and blood work. Their current insurance, the bare minimum plan he'd been paying for out of pocket since getting laid off 9 months ago, had a deductible so high it was essentially decorative. He'd called 2 other clinics that week. One required full payment up front. The other had an appointment slot in 3 weeks. He needed $85 to cover the copay at an urgent care clinic on Division Street that a coworker had told him about, the kind of place that didn't ask too many questions if you paid cash. He needed 50 more for Sophie's cough medication and the generic antibiotics the doctor would almost certainly prescribe. He needed another 90 to cover the last of November's electricity bill before ComEd turned it off on Friday. $640 once, now $85. The math of loss was a specific kind of humiliation. "I'll need a state ID," Frank said. Ethan pulled his wallet from his back pocket and slid his Illinois driver's license across the counter. The woman who had walked in behind him moved to the other side of the shop, toward the display cases along the far wall. Ethan was only peripherally aware of her. He was focused on the ring, on the paperwork Frank was filling out, on the careful internal work of not feeling anything too specifically. Victoria Sterling stood with her hands in the pockets of a charcoal wool coat and looked at the guitars mounted on the far wall without really seeing them. She'd pulled over on West Madison 20 minutes ago because her driver, Marcus, had flagged a traffic alert. Some kind of water main situation on Adams was going to back up the whole corridor, and she'd told him to park while she stretched her legs. She'd been in back-to-back meetings since 6 that morning, first at the downtown Sterling Aerospace offices, then a working lunch that ran until almost 3, then a conference call with the propulsion division in Huntsville that she'd finally cut short because she could feel her own brain starting to loop on itself, the way it did when she'd gone too long without actual quiet. She didn't usually walk into pawn shops. She'd walked past this one on an impulse. Something in the window display, a row of vintage wristwatches, had caught her eye, and she'd thought absently about her father's old Omega, the one that had gone missing in the estate shuffle after he died. She hadn't been looking for it specifically. She'd just gone in. She was looking at a scratched-up acoustic guitar when she heard the number, 85. She didn't turn. She wasn't eavesdropping exactly. The shop was small and quiet, and voices carried. She heard the man say, "Okay." She heard the careful flatness in the single word, the way a person spoke when they were using all their available energy on not breaking. She turned her head, just slightly. The man at the counter was tall, maybe 6'1", with dark hair that needed a cut and a jacket that was clearly a size too big, or maybe he'd lost weight recently and hadn't bought a new one. His hands were on the counter. Between them, on the glass, was a gold ring. Victoria had grown up in boardrooms and airplane hangars. Her father, James Sterling, had been one of the most difficult men she'd ever known. Brilliant, exacting, impossible to please, the kind of man who saw weakness in everything. And her mother had left when Victoria was 9, which had made James the primary force of gravity in her childhood. She had learned to read situations quickly. Threat assessments, her father had called them. Know what you're walking into before you're in it. She didn't know this man, but she read the situation in about 4 seconds. The jacket, the ring, the word okay spoken in that particular voice, the way his shoulders were set, not hunched, not defeated, but controlled. Like a man who had decided long ago that he was not going to show anyone how bad things were, not because he was too proud to ask for help, but because he had no idea who to ask. She watched him take his ID back from the pawn shop owner, fold it into a wallet that she could see from this distance was almost empty. She turned back to the guitar. She was not the type to insert herself into strangers' lives. She had a company to run. She had 340 employees who depended on clear-eyed decisions from her. She'd made a policy, very early on, of not letting sentiment override judgment. She heard the ring click against the glass as the man released it. She pulled out her phone and texted Marcus. Give me 10 more minutes. Ethan took the $85 and $2.50s, which was all Frank had in the register that afternoon, and waited while the man made change. He pocketed the bills without counting them. He'd counted them already in his head. He knew exactly how they would move through the next 4 days. Urgent care, medication, electricity, and then the last $23 would sit in his wallet as a buffer against whatever came next. Something always came next. He'd learned not to be surprised by it. He was turning toward the door when the woman spoke. "Excuse me." He stopped. She was standing near the far wall, maybe 8 feet away, with her hands still in her coat pockets. She was younger than he'd expected from the voice, some early 30s, maybe 30, with dark hair pulled back and the kind of composed, steady expression that people either trained into themselves or were born with. She was looking at him directly. "Sorry," she said. "I don't mean to intrude, She stopped. She seemed to be reconsidering something. "Is the ring irreplaceable?" Ethan stared at her. He wasn't sure he'd heard correctly or understood what she was asking. "What?" "The ring," she said. "I'm asking because there's a difference between something that has monetary value and something that can't be replaced. If it's the first, it doesn't matter. If it's the second..." She paused again. "What's your name?" "I don't..." He shook his head slightly. "Why are you asking me that?" "Because I want to know if the ring matters to you," she said, "and I can't tell from where I'm standing." It was such a strange, direct question that for a moment Ethan didn't have a ready answer. The ring was behind him on the glass counter. He'd just signed the paperwork. It wasn't his anymore, legally. He turned slightly, looking at it, and then looked back at her. "Yes," he said. "It matters." "Then wait a moment," she said. She walked to the counter. She spoke quietly to Frank. Ethan watched with the particular bewilderment of a man who was too tired to fully process what he was seeing. He heard a number, not the full amount, something else, a rental figure, and saw Frank reach behind the counter and hand the ring back in a small envelope. The woman turned and held it out to him. Ethan didn't take it. "What is this?" he said. "It's on consignment for 30 days, she said. Frank holds it, and at the end of 30 days, he gets a fee for the storage. If you want to come back for it, you can. If you can't, it goes back on the market at the end of the month." "You paid for that," Ethan said. "It's not a lot of money. That's not the point." He felt something sharp-edged moving around in his chest, something between gratitude and offense, and he wasn't sure which one was going to surface first. "I'm not giving you anything," she said. "It's a storage arrangement. The ring isn't yours or mine for the next 30 days. She kept holding it out. "You can leave it here if you'd like. I'm just changing the terms slightly." He stood there for a long moment. Outside, a bus horn blared. The radio in the back of the shop played something with too much static to identify. Frank had retreated to the far end of the counter with the studied professionalism of a man who had learned not to witness the private moments happening in his shop. Ethan took the envelope. He didn't say thank you. He wasn't sure thank you was the right word for something this complicated. "I'm Ethan," he said instead. "Victoria," she said. She pulled a business card from her coat pocket and held it out. He took it and looked at it. "Sterling Aerospace. Victoria Sterling, President and CEO." The address was a downtown tower he'd been inside once, years ago, for an industry conference. "You're serious," he said. "I'm always serious," she said. He looked at the card again, then at her. He tried to read the angle, because there was always an angle, he'd learned that, but her face was just level and direct, without the particular performed warmth of someone who wanted something obvious from him. "What do you want?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I saw something and I reacted. That's all." She tucked her hands back into her pockets. "Keep the card. Throw it away. Whatever you decide." She nodded to Frank and walked out of the shop. The broken bell gave its flat sound. Ethan stood in the middle of the pawn shop with $85 in his pocket and a business card in one hand and a small envelope containing his wedding ring in the other, and he did not know what to do with any of it. He was back on the bus 20 minutes later, heading north towards Sophie. He had the ring envelope in his inside jacket pocket, close to his chest, which was either sentimental or stupid, he wasn't sure. He had the business card in his wallet, tucked behind his expired gym membership, and the medical insurance card that was technically current but practically useless. He stared out the window at the city moving past, the late afternoon traffic on Milwaukee Avenue, the restaurants and laundromats and phone repair places, the people on the sidewalk walking with their heads down against the wind, and tried to reconstruct what had just happened in a way that made logical sense. A woman walked into a pawn shop. She watched him sell his wedding ring. She paid for a 30-day consignment instead. He pulled the card out again and looked at it. Sterling Aerospace was not a small company. He knew the name. When he'd been working, before the layoffs, before Maya, before everything, Sterling Aerospace had been a competitor and a reference point, a company that his colleagues talked about with a specific mix of professional respect and rivalry. They were newer than the traditional aerospace giants, but they'd moved fast, won contracts that people hadn't expected them to win, and built a reputation for doing technically difficult things with fewer resources than anyone thought possible. He'd applied there once, actually. 5 years ago, when Maya was in her second year of treatment, and he was already starting to feel the financial pressure and had begun quietly sending out resumes. He hadn't even gotten a call back. The bus lurched to a stop at an intersection, and Ethan looked at the card again. He thought about what it would mean to call that number. He thought about sitting across from some HR person and explaining the 9-month employment gap, the years before that when he'd been working whatever he could find while managing Sophie's care and their household, the way his technical skills had been accumulating rust while the industry kept moving forward. He thought about the particular expression people got when they looked at his resume now, not unkind, just conclusive. He put the card back in his wallet. Mrs. Kowalski was watching a game show when Ethan came in. She was sitting in his armchair, her preferred spot, with a cup of tea balanced on her knee, and she raised her eyebrows at him by way of greeting. "She's sleeping," Mrs. Kowalski said. "Fever went down about an hour ago." "How much down?" 100 flat, last I checked. She woke up for some broth around 2 and went back under." "She eat anything solid?" "Half a cracker, didn't push it." Ethan nodded. He set his keys on the kitchen counter and looked down the short hallway toward Sophie's door, which was cracked open. He could hear her breathing from here, slightly irregular, the wet undertones still present, but steadier than this morning. "How was your day?" Mrs. Kowalski said, which was her version of asking whether he'd gotten the money. "Fine," Ethan said. He pulled 2 20s and a 5 from his pocket, his share from the transaction after the consignment fee, and set them on the counter. "For your time this week." "Ethan, I know. I've told you not to do this." "I know." He was already moving down the hallway. "I'll be back in a second." He pushed Sophie's door open. The room was small. They were in a 2-bedroom unit in a 6-flat in Logan Square, and Sophie's room was barely big enough for her bed, a low dresser, and the secondhand bookshelf he'd painted purple 2 summers ago because that had been her favorite color that year. Now her favorite color was green, specifically a shade she called tree green, which was different from regular green in ways she'd tried to explain to him multiple times. She was asleep on her side, one arm tucked under her face, her hair loose and tangled on the pillow. Her cheeks were still slightly flushed, but her breathing was easier than this morning. Ethan stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment without moving. Sophie had been 4 when Maya died. Old enough to have memories, real ones, not the constructed kind, but young enough that the memories were softening at the edges now, becoming harder to hold precisely. She still asked about her mother sometimes, not with grief exactly, but with a child's particular need to understand the shape of her own history. Where did we go for my birthday that year? What was Mama's job again? Was I there when she got sick? Ethan answered what he could and deflected what he couldn't, and in the process had become something he hadn't expected to be. Not just a father, but a keeper of another person's history. He checked her temperature with the thermometer from the bathroom. 100.3. Slightly up from what Mrs. Kowalski had said, but not alarming. He'd take her to the urgent care clinic in the morning. He had enough now for the copay. He pressed his hand lightly against her forehead, and she stirred without waking, shifted slightly, and settled back. He stood up and went back to the kitchen. "She'll be okay," Mrs. Kowalski said from the living room. It was not a question. It was the kind of statement older women made, the kind that had the weight of lived experience behind it, having watched children come through worse than this. "Yeah," Ethan said. He filled a glass of water at the sink and stood at the counter, looking out the window at the narrow strip of backyard, the November gray light, the bare branches of the maple that overhung the fence. He thought about what he used to be. Not in a pitying way. He'd made an agreement with himself years ago to keep self-pity off the table, because it was the most useless feeling he'd ever encountered, and he'd encountered a lot of them, just factually. He thought about who he had been at 26, 27, when he was working at Meridian Systems on the propulsion team, running calculations for the attitude control thrusters on a low Earth orbit satellite platform. He had been good at it, not in a self-aggrandizing way. He'd been surrounded by brilliant people, and he knew his own rank among them, but genuinely competent, the kind of competent that was getting better every year, building toward something. Then Maya's diagnosis, then the costs, then the choices. He'd reduced his hours first, then taken a different position with a smaller company because the schedule was more flexible. Then that company had been acquired and the whole team eliminated. Then a year of freelance consulting work that dried up when the aerospace contracts started tightening. Then the last job, a contract position with a municipal infrastructure firm that had nothing to do with aerospace but paid the bills, until they'd gone through their own round of cuts. 9 months of nothing. 9 months of job applications that went nowhere, interviews that were politely conclusive, the slow accumulation of evidence that the industry had moved on, and he hadn't moved with it. He pulled the business card out of his wallet and set it on the kitchen counter, looked at it. Victoria Sterling, President and CEO. He tried to think clearly about this, setting aside the impulse to dismiss it, setting aside the practical objections and the noise of his own complicated feelings about charity and pity and the whole afternoon. What would it actually mean to call that number? He'd been an aerospace engineer, not a mediocre one. He'd been building toward something real before everything went sideways. The knowledge was old now, partially, and the industry had advanced in specific ways he wasn't current on, but the foundational thinking, the way he understood physical systems, the way he worked through problems, that didn't atrophy the way software skills did. That was structural. And he was 32. Not 22, but not over the hill. He left the card on the counter and went to make dinner. The urgent care clinic on Division Street was the kind of place that had been designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Molded plastic chairs in rows, a television mounted high on the wall showing a morning news program with the sound off, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly unwell regardless of their actual condition. Ethan sat in the waiting area with Sophie in his lap while she drew on the back of a form with a pen he'd found in his jacket pocket. She was drawing what she'd explained was a horse, though it currently looked more like a dog with structural issues. "Daddy," she said. Is this a real doctor?" "Yes." "Does she have a real office?" "This is her office." Sophie looked around with the skeptical assessment of a 6-year-old who had seen an office before. "It's not like a regular office." "Offices come in different kinds," Ethan said. She went back to her horse. He had his phone out. He'd spent the last 2 days turning the card over in his mind. Not obsessing. He didn't have the energy for obsession, but returning to it in the spaces between things. The quiet minutes after Sophie was asleep, the 10-minute bus rides. He'd looked up Sterling Aerospace again, this time more carefully. They had just won a defense contract for a guidance systems project, which meant they were in an expansion phase. They had a propulsion engineering division that had apparently been building out a new team. He had the number open on his phone. He hadn't called. The thing that stopped him wasn't pride exactly. It was harder to name than pride. It was something to do with the dynamic, with being someone who had been seen in a pawn shop at the lowest point of a Tuesday afternoon and selected as a charitable cause. He'd spent the last 3 years making sure he wasn't that, making sure Sophie had enough, making sure the utility bills were managed, making sure the apartment was warm and the fridge had something in it. He had failed at that in increments, piece by piece, until he was selling his wedding ring for $85. But the effort, the specific effort not to need anyone in that way, had been constant and exhausting, and he wasn't sure he could just set it down. "Mr. Carter?" A nurse appeared in the doorway. Ethan put his phone in his pocket. "Come on, Bug," he said to Sophie. "What?" The diagnosis was a lower respiratory infection, bacterial in origin, which the doctor at the clinic, a tired, efficient woman in her 40s named Dr. Patel, said was entirely treatable with a 10-day course of amoxicillin and rest, and was absolutely not to be confused with the bronchitis it resembled if you weren't looking carefully. She had a manner that Ethan appreciated. She talked to Sophie directly, asked her questions, and waited for the answers, and then translated the medical facts for Ethan without talking down to him. "Has she had infections like this before?" Dr. Patel asked. "Twice," Ethan said. "Once when she was 3, once last winter. Recurring lower respiratory infections in a child this age are worth keeping an eye on." She was writing the prescription. "Does she have a regular pediatrician?" "She did." Dr. Patel looked up briefly, then back at the pad. She had the expression of someone who understood the gap between did and does. "The amoxicillin runs about $40 generic," she said. "There are community health programs in this area that can help with ongoing pediatric care if the cost is a barrier. I can give you a list." "I know about them," Ethan said. "I've looked into them." "Okay." She handed him the prescription. "She'll start feeling better in about 3 days. If the fever spikes above 103 or she develops difficulty breathing, go to the ER, don't wait." He nodded. Outside, Sophie held his hand on the way to the bus stop and asked if she was going to get a shot, and he told her the shot part was done. She accepted this with the specific relief of a child who had been quietly dreading this piece of information for several hours. "Daddy," she said, after a while. "Yeah. Are we poor?" He was quiet for a moment. The bus stop was half a block ahead. The wind was doing its November thing. "We're in a tight spot," he said. "What's a tight spot?" "It's when things are harder than usual for a while," he said, "and then they get easier." "How do you know they get easier?" "They always do," he said. She seemed to accept this, or at least to file it for later consideration. She swung their joined hands slightly as they walked. He pulled out his phone with his free hand. He opened Victoria Sterling's number. He thought about tight spots, about the ring in the consignment envelope, sitting in a drawer at Goldstein's Pawn on West Madison with 30 days on the clock, about Dr. Patel asking whether Sophie had a regular pediatrician in a tone that had been careful not to be unkind. He pressed call. It rang 3 times. He was already composing the voice message in his head, the careful professional version of himself. "Victoria Sterling." She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice direct and unhesitating, no corporate softness. "This is Ethan Carter," he said, "from the pawn shop. You gave me your card." A brief silence. "I remember," she said. "How's the ring?" "Still in the case," he said. "Look." He stopped, started again. "I'm not calling about the ring. I want to be clear about that. I'm not calling to say thank you or to explain myself or any of that. I'm calling because—" He looked down at Sophie, who was watching him with open curiosity. "Because I used to work in aerospace engineering, and I've been out of the industry for a while, and if there's a conversation worth having, I'd rather have it based on what I can actually do, not on what you saw in that shop." Another silence. Shorter. "Fair," Victoria Sterling said. "Come in on Thursday. Ask for Janet at the front desk. She'll have your name. Bring your resume if you have a current one, but don't worry too much about what's on it." What time on Thursday? 9 a.m. Okay, he said. Mr. Carter, she said. Yeah. I didn't give you my card out of pity. Her voice was even, neither warm nor cold. I gave you my card because I recognized something. We'll see if I'm right. She ended the call. Ethan stood at the bus stop on Division Street with his daughter's hand in his and the phone still at his ear, the city moving around them in its usual indifferent way. And he did not feel hope exactly. Hope was too clean a word for what was moving around in his chest, too unearned. What he felt was something grittier and more uncertain than hope. Something more like the specific alertness of a man who had been running on empty for a long time and had just spotted something on the horizon that might or might not be what it looked like. He put the phone in his pocket. Who was that? Sophie asked. Somebody about a job, he said. Sophie nodded gravely. Good, she said. We could use that. He looked down at her. The 6-year-old person with the dark eyes and the practical assessment of the situation and the half-finished horse drawing folded in her pocket. And something moved through him that was sharper and more complicated than anything the day had offered so far. Yeah, he said. We could. The bus came, and they got on. Thursday morning arrived the way bad weather does, not all at once, but in increments. Ethan was up at 5:15, which was not unusual. He'd been waking early for years. The habit formed during Sophie's infancy and never fully reversed, his body locked into the schedule of someone who needed the quiet hours before the day's demands started stacking up. He stood in the kitchen in the dark and made coffee with the cheap grounds he bought in bulk from the discount grocery on Kedzie, and he looked at the clothes he'd laid out on the back of the kitchen chair the night before. His interview outfit, which was a phrase that felt slightly absurd given what it actually was, consisted of his one remaining dress shirt, a blue Oxford that he'd owned for 4 years and kept in the back of the closet for occasions that required it, and the dark slacks that still fit but had a small repair near the left knee that he'd done himself with iron-on fabric tape. He'd polished his shoes the previous night with a kit he'd dug out from under the bathroom sink, the kind that came in a round tin and left your fingers black for half a day. He'd put on the shirt and looked at himself in the bathroom mirror for a long moment, trying to assess what a person who didn't know him would see. He looked like a man who was trying. That was the honest summary. Someone who had taken care with the available materials. His resume was on the kitchen table in a manila folder. He'd spent Tuesday evening updating it on the library computer, filling in the gap years as best he could, the consulting work, the contract position with the infrastructure firm, and it looked reasonable if you didn't look too closely at the dates. If you looked closely at the dates, it looked like what it was. A skilled engineer who had spent 5 years being dragged sideways by life. Mrs. Kowalski was coming at 8:30 to be with Sophie, who was 3 days into her amoxicillin and well enough to be irritated about staying home from school, but not well enough to actually go. Ethan had explained where he was going in the simplest possible terms. Interview, Sophie had said, with the clinical brevity of a child repeating back information. Yes. For a job? For a real job, yeah. She'd nodded. She'd been watching him from the couch with her blanket pulled up to her chin, and that particular expression she got, something that was either approval or suspicion. He was never entirely sure which. Wear the blue shirt, she'd said. I was already going to wear the blue shirt. Good. The Sterling Aerospace offices occupied floors 14 through 22 of a building on West Walker, the kind of building that had been designed to project solidity. Dark glass, brushed steel, the lobby done in pale stone with good lighting. Ethan came through the revolving door at 8:52 and stood for a moment in the lobby, getting his bearings. The woman at the front desk was Janet, per the nameplate, and she was in her 50s with the particular composed efficiency of someone who had been managing executive schedules for decades and had heard everything twice. When Ethan gave his name, she looked at her computer, nodded once, and handed him a visitor badge. 15th floor, Janet said. Ms. Sterling's assistant will meet you at the elevator. The elevator was fast and almost silent. Ethan watched the numbers climb and tried to remember the last time he'd been in a building like this. 4 years ago, at least. Maybe 5. The aerospace industry had a specific physicality to it. The buildings, the equipment, the scale of things, and being back inside it felt like putting on clothes that used to fit well, and finding they mostly still did, but in slightly different places. The assistant was a young man named Derek, who had the harried, over-caffeinated energy of someone who ran on urgency and to-do lists. He shook Ethan's hand quickly and led him down a corridor that opened into a larger workspace, open plan on one side, glass-walled offices on the other, and Ethan registered, in passing, the kind of work environment that indicated the company was actually doing something. Not a showroom, actual work. People at desks with technical documents and laptops open to modeling software he recognized. Derek deposited him in a small conference room with a glass wall overlooking the main workspace and said Ms. Sterling would be with him shortly, and then vanished. Ethan sat down and put his folder on the table and looked through the glass at the engineering floor. He recognized the software on the screens, an older version of the platform he'd used at Meridian, but the interface was similar enough. He could see what looked like stress analysis outputs on one screen, and on another, what might have been a trajectory modeling run. He found himself leaning forward slightly, not meaning to, pulled by something that was basically involuntary. He sat back. He was aware, in a specific and uncomfortable way, that he was about to be evaluated, not just for the position, for the gap, for the years, for the explanation he'd have to provide for why a trained engineer with his background had spent the last half-decade doing infrastructure contracts and consulting work, and nothing that appeared directly relevant to the industry he was sitting inside right now. He'd rehearsed answers. He knew better than to wing it. The door opened and Victoria Sterling came in. She was in a different kind of professional than she'd been at the pawn shop. Same directness, but here there was a formality to it, a structure. Dark blazer, no jewelry except a simple watch. She had a coffee mug in one hand and a tablet in the other, and she sat down across from him and set both on the table. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for the meeting," he said. They looked at each other for a moment. The pawn shop sat between them, unacknowledged. "I read your resume," she said. "Okay. Before I ask you about it, I want to tell you what I'm actually looking for, so we don't waste each other's time." She set down her coffee mug. "We have a guidance systems project that's been in progress for 18 months. We're 8 months from a delivery milestone, and we have an issue I'm not going to detail fully today. But the short version is that our propulsion team is technically capable, but has a communication problem that's slowing everything down. I need someone who can work between the analysis side and the systems integration side. Someone who understands both enough to catch what's falling in the gap." Ethan nodded. He was listening carefully. "Your background at Meridian," she said. "The attitude control work." "Thruster calibration and integration testing for the Sentinel platform," he said. "Mostly the RCS module, but I had crossover into guidance during the final validation phase." "Who did you work under?" "Dale Hoffman was the team lead, propulsion side. I reported to him, but I was informally attached to the integration group toward the end of the project because we kept finding handoff errors. The analysis team would run their models, the integration team would implement, and something was getting lost in translation and nobody could figure out where. I was the one who started sitting in on both teams' reviews." Victoria was watching him with the specific attention of someone who was listening to what was said, but also to how it was said. "What did you find?" she said. "The analysis team was running validation models with one set of thermal assumptions," Ethan said. "The integration team had updated their thermal specs 2 months earlier, and nobody had looped back to the analysts. Classic documentation failure. It had been creating a half-degree error in the calibration outputs that was compounding across the test cycles. It wasn't catastrophic, but it would have created problems during the orbital insertion phase." "How long had it been running?" 7 weeks, as best we could tell. "And you caught it." "I was the only person in both rooms," Ethan said. "It wasn't complicated once you were in both rooms." Victoria looked at him for a moment. "Why'd you leave Meridian?" He'd prepared for this. "My wife was ill. I needed a more flexible schedule. I took a position with a smaller company that could accommodate that. When she died, I was in the middle of managing a lot of things simultaneously, and the career decisions I made during that time were about keeping things together, not about trajectory." He said it evenly, not defensively, not softly, just as fact. Victoria didn't offer condolences, which Ethan appreciated more than he would have expected. She just nodded and moved on, which was its own kind of respect. "How current are you?" she asked. Honestly? Please. My fundamentals are solid. The physics doesn't change. My software is 2 versions behind. I've been working on that, but I'm not current. My working knowledge of some of the newer guidance architectures is theoretical rather than hands-on. He paused. I'm a fast learner when I'm inside the problem. I've always been faster inside the problem than I am in the abstract. What does that mean practically? It means put me in a room with your team and a set of actual technical documents, and I'll be more useful to you in a week than I'll look on paper. She looked at him steadily. He held it. He wasn't going to look away from this. He'd come here to be seen accurately, not charitably, and the distinction mattered to him. I'm going to bring you in to meet 2 people, she said. Mark Okafor, who leads our propulsion integration team, and Dr. Susan Choi, who runs our analysis group. If they think you're worth a trial, I'll back it. If they don't, I'll tell you honestly. She paused. I won't override my technical people for reasons that aren't technical. I wouldn't want you to, Ethan said. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile. Something more considered. Wait here, she said. I'll have Derek get Mark. Mark Okafor was 41, Nigerian-American, broad-shouldered in the way of someone who had played sports seriously in another life and kept most of the muscle. He came into the conference room with the energy of someone who was constantly slightly overscheduled and had learned to conduct most business while standing. He shook Ethan's hand with a grip that was direct and measuring. Ethan Carter, he said, reading the name off some internal list. Meridian Systems. 7 years, Ethan said. Mark sat down across from him and crossed his arms on the table. Not hostile. Evaluating. That was a while ago. It was. What have you been doing since? Ethan gave the honest version. The infrastructure contract work, the gap. He didn't dress it up. Mark watched him through it. He had the expression of a man who had interviewed a lot of people and had developed efficient machinery for filtering out the ones who were selling themselves versus the ones who were reporting. You know what my problem is? Mark said, when Ethan had finished. The communication gap between analysis and integration, Ethan said. Mark blinked. She told you. She gave me the outline. I've seen the version of it before. Mark leaned back. The version of it. It's always a version of the same thing, Ethan said. 2 teams working from different assumptions and nobody whose job it is to sit in both rooms. The specific technical details are different every time, but the structure of the problem is consistent. Mark looked at him for a moment. Then he pulled a folder off the small stack he'd brought in with him and slid it across the table. Look at this. It was a summary document, 5 pages, technical but not classified. A propulsion test report with anomalous results flagged in red. The analysis team's interpretation was clipped to the back. Ethan read it. He took his time. Mark sat across from him and waited, and to Mark's credit, he didn't drum his fingers or check his phone. He let Ethan work through it. It took about 8 minutes. The analysis team is saying the variance is within acceptable bounds, Ethan said, but they're using a margin calculation that doesn't account for the change in operating temperature at the lower altitude range. He flipped back to a page in the middle of the test report. The actual test conditions were 11 degrees colder than the baseline they modeled against. At that temperature differential, the margin shrinks. He looked up. Is this a current project document? Mark's expression had changed. Not dramatically, just a small tightening of attention. Why? Mark said. Because if it is, someone needs to rerun the analysis with the corrected thermal parameters before this goes to the next validation phase. A silence. Where did you see that? Mark said. It wasn't challenging. It was the question of a person who needed to understand the answer. Ethan pointed to a figure in the test report. The ambient temperature for the second test cycle is in the raw data section. It's not in the summary. Whoever wrote the summary pulled from the baseline parameters and didn't check whether the test conditions matched. He set the document down. It's in the fine print, but it's there. Mark was quiet for a moment. He uncrossed his arms. That document is from 2 weeks ago, he said. Then you have time to fix it before it becomes a real problem. Mark looked at the document, then at Ethan, then at something in the middle distance that was neither of them. He had the expression of a man doing a rapid internal recalculation. I need to make a call, he said. He stood up. Wait here. He left the conference room and Ethan watched through the glass wall as Mark walked quickly to an office in the far corner, already on his phone. Dr. Susan Choi came in about 20 minutes later, and she was everything Mark Okafor wasn't in terms of demeanor. Smaller, quieter, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the specific intellectual formality of someone who had spent most of her career at universities before moving to industry. She had a look Ethan recognized, the kind of careful, watchful assessment that came from someone who had been underestimated often enough to have learned to do the estimating very early. She sat down with her own folder and looked at his resume for a full minute without speaking. "Your Meridian work," she said. "The attitude control module. You were on the thermal modeling side or the hardware side?" "Hardware primarily, but I was building my own verification models to check the hardware outputs, independently." "Why independently?" "Because I wanted to understand what I was testing, not just run the protocol." She looked at him over the top of her glasses, which she'd brought down to the end of her nose. "Who taught you the modeling side?" "I taught myself. Reference texts and a lot of overtime." "Which reference texts?" He told her. She asked him 2 follow-up questions, specific, technical, the kind designed to identify whether someone had actually read something or just cited it. He answered both without hedging. "You found an error in our validation summary," she said. "Mark told you." "Mark is currently explaining to my senior analyst why he needs to redo 2 weeks of work before Friday." Her voice was perfectly level, but there was something underneath it. Not irritation, but a kind of rueful acknowledgement. "My analyst is unhappy." "I'm sorry about that," Ethan said. "Don't be," Dr. Choi said. "It needed to be found." She removed her glasses entirely and held them by one arm. "You're very far behind on current software platforms." "Yes. The modeling tools we use are significantly advanced from what you'd have used at Meridian." "I know. I've been studying the documentation. I'm not current, but I understand the architecture." "Studying the documentation at home is not the same as working in the tools." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She looked at him steadily. "What makes you think you can get up to speed fast enough to be useful?" He thought about this. He could give her the rehearsed answer about being a quick learner, but she'd heard that from everyone. He gave her the real one instead. "Because I spent 2 years teaching myself propulsion modeling with no institutional support and a borrowed textbook while working full-time and caring for a sick family member, so," he said. "I'm slow when I have no reason to move fast. I'm not slow when I do." A silence. "That's a different kind of answer than I usually get," Dr. Choi said. "I've been giving the other kind for 9 months, Ethan said. "It hasn't worked." She almost smiled at that. Not quite, but almost. She stood up. "I'll talk to Victoria," she said. She paused at the door. "The thing you found in that report, the temperature differential issue. You saw it in 8 minutes. I read fast. Most people wouldn't have looked at the raw data section." "Most people assume the summary is accurate," he said. She nodded once, with the deliberate precision of a person who nodded only when they meant it and left. "Awesome." Victoria came back 20 minutes later. She sat down across from him and set her coffee on the table. A different cup, which meant she'd refilled it, which meant time had passed in ways he hadn't fully tracked. "Mark wants to put you on a 90-day trial," she said. "Probationary engineering position, working between his team and Susan's group. Officially, your title is Integration Review Specialist, which is a made-up title we created this morning because we don't have a standard role that describes exactly what we're asking you to do." Ethan said nothing for a moment. "The salary for the probationary period is $62,000 annualized," Victoria continued. "If the trial converts, it goes to market rate for your experience level, which we'd negotiate at that point. Benefits start at 60 days. She paused. "That's not a great offer in absolute terms. I want to be transparent about that." "It's more than I'm making," Ethan said. "I know." He looked at the table for a moment. 62,000. Against his current 0, it was transformative, but he was aware that it was still a significant step below where he'd been at the peak of his career, and the word probationary sat in the sentence with particular weight. He understood what it meant. He had 90 days to prove that Victoria's judgment about him was correct, in front of people who hadn't made that judgment and hadn't committed to it. "What happens if it doesn't work out?" he said. "Then we part ways," Victoria said. I won't make you promises I can't keep. If you come in and can't keep up, I'll tell you directly and we'll end the arrangement." "Okay," he said. She looked at him. "That's it? What else would I say?" "Most people negotiate." "I might negotiate later," Ethan said. "Right now I want to know if I can do the job. The money matters when I know I can." He paused. "I'll tell you right now, I might not make it through 90 days. I might come in and find that the gap is bigger than I think it is. If that happens, I'll tell you before you have to tell me." She studied him. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "Someone more grateful," she said. It was direct, not unkind. "I am grateful," he said, "but grateful isn't the same as compliant, and I don't think that's what you're actually looking for." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the glass wall, the engineering floor moved in its usual patterns. People at desks, conversations at whiteboards, the low continuous hum of technical work being done. "Start Monday," she said. He stood up and they shook hands across the table. Her grip was firm and brief. "Ms. Sterling," he said. "Victoria. Victoria." He picked up his folder. "The ring, I don't want to not address it." "You don't have to." "I know I don't." He stood at the door. "I'm going to get it back. I wanted you to know that." She looked at him with an expression that was harder to read than the ones before it, something less professional, more considered. "I know you will," she said. He called Mrs. Kowalski from the sidewalk outside the building, squinting in the thin November light that had finally broken through the clouds. "Well," she said before he finished saying her name. "Monday," he said. A pause. Then a sound from Mrs. Kowalski that was something between a sigh and a small, contained expression of relief. "Good," she said. "Good. Sophie's been asking every 20 minutes. "Tell her yes," he said. "Tell her yourself. She's right here." There was the muffled sound of the phone changing hands, and then Sophie's voice came on. Slightly hoarse from the last of the cough, slightly too loud, the way she always spoke on the phone because she didn't trust the technology. "Daddy, did you get it?" "I got it." "The job?" "The real one." A brief silence. He could picture her, sitting on the couch under her blanket, doing the internal processing that preceded every official reaction. "Okay," she said. "Can we have pizza?" He laughed. It came out slightly unsteady at the edges, which he hadn't expected. "Yeah, Bug," he said. "We can have pizza." He stood on the sidewalk on West Wacker with his manila folder under his arm and the city moving around him in its usual indifferent way, and he let himself stand there for a minute without moving anywhere. He didn't try to identify exactly what he was feeling because it was several things at once, and some of them were contradictory and none of them were clean. There was relief, which he'd expected. There was something that sat close to fear, not of failing exactly, but of what it would cost him and Sophie if he did. There was the specific, uncomfortable awareness of being in someone's debt in a way that couldn't be quickly cleared, and his complicated feelings about that. And underneath all of it, running quieter but steadier than the rest, was something he'd almost forgotten the texture of. The thing you felt when you were back inside the problem, and the problem was real, and your mind was already moving. He started walking toward the bus stop. He had the weekend to get ready. He had 90 days to prove what he was worth. He had a 6-year-old at home who had been promised pizza and was probably already selecting toppings with the focused intensity she brought to all important decisions. He put his head down against the wind. He walked. The first Monday arrived cold and overcast. The sky the particular flat gray of a Chicago December that didn't commit to snow, but didn't let go of the threat either. Ethan was up at 5, dressed by 5:40, and standing in the kitchen drinking coffee by the time the darkness outside the window started thinning at the edges. He'd laid out Sophie's clothes the night before and written Mrs. Kowalski a note with the school pickup time and the aftercare number, and he'd packed his bag with the printed technical documentation he'd spent the weekend reading, the publicly available specs on Sterling's current guidance platform, a paper from an aerospace conference 2 years ago that Dr. Choi had co-authored, and a yellow legal pad that he'd already filled 6 pages of with notes, questions, and the specific gaps in his own knowledge that he'd identified and ranked by urgency. He was not ready. He knew he was not ready. The weekend had confirmed exactly how large the technical gap was in specific areas. The modeling software in particular was more advanced than he'd hoped, and some of the architectural decisions in Sterling's current guidance systems reflected developments in the field that postdated his hands-on experience. He was starting from behind, which was a fact he'd accepted as the operating condition rather than something to feel bad about. Feeling bad about it wouldn't close the gap. Working would. Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway at 6:50 in her socks, her hair at a complicated angle from sleep. She looked at him with one eye slightly more open than the other. "You're already dressed," she said. "I have to be there early." She considered this. "Why early?" "Because I'm new," he said. "New people get there early." She absorbed this rule into her internal library of how things worked and shuffled to the refrigerator for the orange juice. She had a way of moving in the morning that was entirely without urgency, her small body still halfway in sleep, and Ethan watched her pour juice with the particular tenderness of someone watching a thing they loved do something completely ordinary. "Mrs. Kowalski is coming at 7:30, he said. "School clothes are on your chair." "I know." "The purple sweater, not the—" "Daddy, I know how to get dressed." "You left the house in 2 different shoes last Tuesday." "They were the same color," she said with dignity. He kissed the top of her head and left. The Sterling Aerospace Engineering floor at 7:45 in the morning was different from what it had been on Thursday. The interview version of the place had been inhabited by a handful of people and filtered through the particular formality of being evaluated. The working version was louder, more populated, with the layered noise of a technical environment in full operation. Printers running, phone conversations. Someone running a verification test somewhere in the back that produced a rhythmic mechanical sound. The ever-present undercurrent of air conditioning doing its best against the heat generated by 100 computers running heavy-load software. Derek met him at the elevator again and walked him to his workspace, a desk in the middle of the integration team section, between 2 engineers who were both already at their computers and neither of whom looked up when Ethan arrived. His computer was not set up. His access credentials were in a printed envelope on the desk, with a sticky note from Derek that said it would be by before 9. There was no chair because the one that belonged to the desk was being used by someone 3 rows over, and it took Ethan 15 minutes of navigating the office politics of a new workspace to locate a spare. He sat down, opened his legal pad, and started on the access setup. Mark Okafor appeared at his desk at 8:20. "You're here," Mark said. "I am." "Early." "I'm new," Ethan said, which made Mark's mouth do something that wasn't quite a smile. Mark pulled up a chair from the empty desk behind Ethan's and sat down. He had a tablet with him, and he set it flat on Ethan's desk and pulled up a project file. "Let me give you the real version of what's going on, not the interview version." "I'd appreciate that." "The project is called Orion 7, Guidance and Navigation Systems for a Medium-Range Unmanned Platform. Defense contract, delivery milestone in about 7 months. Though that timeline has already slipped twice, and nobody upstairs is happy about it." He moved through several screens on the tablet. "We have 2 main problems. First problem? The interface between the propulsion calibration data and the navigation control loop has an accumulated error that we haven't been able to fully characterize. We know it's there. We know it affects the guidance accuracy at specific altitude bands. We can't pin down exactly where it originates." Ethan nodded. He recognized the shape of this. "Second problem," Mark continued, "is that my team and Susan's team have a communication dynamic that is, let's call it suboptimal. Susan's analysts run their models and send us outputs. My integration guys implement. When something doesn't work, each side thinks it's the other's problem. The project review meetings have become," he stopped, "unproductive." "How unproductive, Schatz?" Ethan said. "Last week's review ended with one of my senior engineers walking out and 2 people not speaking to each other for the rest of the day." Ethan looked at the tablet screen. A propulsion calibration log was open. Columns of numbers, test cycle data, the kind of dense technical record that needed to be read carefully in the right direction to yield anything useful. "So my job is," Ethan said, "to find the error source in the guidance interface and fix the team dynamic at the same time. In 90 days, Mark said, without the authority to tell anyone what to do. Great, Ethan said. Mark looked at him. You're not alarmed. I'm alarmed, Ethan said. I'm just not going to be usefully alarmed until I've read through the documentation. Mark nodded and stood up. I'll have the project files transferred to your system when IT gets your access sorted. In the meantime, he tapped the tablet and pulled up a different file. This is the error characterization report we put together 3 months ago. It's the best analysis we have of the guidance problem. Read it and tell me what you think. He left the tablet on Ethan's desk and walked away. Calm. It arrived at 9:15 and Ethan's access was live by 9:45. He spent the first 2 hours reading. He read the error characterization report and the underlying data, and he read the project archive going back 14 months, the test cycle logs, the meeting notes, the revision history on the main technical specifications. He read the way he always read technical documents, fast on the first pass, building a structural map of the problem, flagging the places where something didn't add up, then going back slowly on the second pass to look at those places more carefully. By noon, he had 7 flags on his legal pad. He also had the experience, which he'd been halfway expecting, of walking into the break room for coffee and having nobody speak to him. He recognized the specific social temperature of a workplace where people were reserving judgment on a new arrival who'd come in through an unusual channel. The Orion 7 team had been working together for over a year under significant pressure. An outsider dropped in by the CEO was not going to be welcomed automatically. The engineer who sat 2 desks to his left was named James Whitfield, mid-40s, trim, with the practice-neutral expression of someone who had been in the industry long enough to have opinions about everything and the discipline to express them only selectively. He stopped by Ethan's desk at 1 o'clock with a coffee mug in his hand and looked at the legal pad. 7 flags already, Whitfield said. 6 might be nothing, Ethan said. And the 7th? Ethan looked at the notation. It was a question he'd written with 2 underlines, which was his system for something he couldn't yet explain but couldn't let go of. In the error characterization report, the team had analyzed the guidance accuracy problem across 5 altitude bands and found errors in 3 of them. The errors in bands 2, 3, and 4, 2, 3, and 4 were well documented, and the proposed correction was reasonable, but bands 1 and 5 had been marked as within acceptable parameters. The bands 1 and 5 analysis, Ethan said. The team concluded they were clean. They are clean, Whitfield said. We ran 3 separate verification cycles on those. What were the ambient temperature conditions during the verification cycles? Whitfield went still for just a moment. The practice-neutral expression held. Standard lab conditions, he said. The operational profile for this platform at the low and high altitude extremes. Ethan pulled up the platform specifications on his screen and turned the monitor slightly. The temperature range at operational altitude band 1 is significantly below standard lab conditions, and band 5 runs hot. Whitfield looked at the screen. He said nothing for a moment. The verification cycles were run at standard conditions because the temp differential wasn't considered material, he said. Was that documented as a decision, that the differential wasn't material? Whitfield's jaw moved slightly. I'd have to check. I'm not saying you're wrong, Ethan said. I'm saying if it wasn't documented as a deliberate decision, it might look like an oversight in the audit trail. And if it actually is material, it would reopen the entire band 1 and 5 analysis, Whitfield said. Yes. Whitfield looked at the screen a moment longer, then at Ethan. You've been here 4 hours, Whitfield said. I know. And you're already suggesting we reopen work we closed 3 months ago. I'm asking a question, Ethan said. I might be wrong. I'd rather be wrong loudly than right quietly on something like this. Whitfield studied him with the specific attention of a man recalibrating. Not warmly, but not dismissively either. He was a technical professional, and whatever his reservations about Ethan's arrival, he had the professional integrity to follow a valid technical question to its conclusion. I'll pull the verification documentation, Whitfield said. He walked back to his desk. The first project review meeting that Ethan attended was on Wednesday afternoon, and it was everything Mark had described and slightly worse. The conference room had a long table and too many people around it. Mark's integration team sat on one side. Whitfield, a young engineer named Torres, who radiated the barely contained energy of someone who was right too often and had stopped being diplomatic about it, and two others. On the other side, Dr. Choi's analysis team. Her senior analyst, a careful-faced man named Rourke, who was still visibly unhappy about having to redo 2 weeks of work, and two junior analysts whose expressions ranged from anxious to checked out. Victoria was not there. This was a working-level meeting. Her absence was deliberate. Ethan had figured that out by the second day. She got summaries. She let the technical people work. The meeting started with a status update from Rourke, who presented the revised analysis incorporating the corrected thermal parameters, the fix that Ethan had flagged on his interview day. The new results showed the guidance error in bands 2, 3, and 4 was actually wider than previously characterized. "So we were underestimating the error," Torres said. He said it with the particular tone of someone who had suspected this and was documenting that he'd suspected it. "The previous analysis was based on the baseline parameters," Rourke said, with the controlled patience of a man who had explained this already. "The thermal deviation in the actual test conditions was a documentation gap, not an analytical failure." "The output was still wrong," Torres said. "The output was right given the inputs we had." "The inputs were wrong, so the output—" "Gentlemen," Mark said. Silence. Ethan had been sitting quietly at the end of the table, listening and taking notes. He had 17 days of project documents in his head and a growing map of how the team dysfunction was feeding the technical problem and vice versa. The communication breakdown wasn't just interpersonal friction. It was producing actual information gaps in the technical record, places where a decision had been made in one room and never formally communicated to the other, where an assumption embedded in one team's work was invisible to the other team's implementation. "Can I ask something?" Ethan said. Everyone looked at him. The particular attention a new person gets in a meeting, half curious, half waiting for you to say something wrong. "The error characterization in bands 1 and 5, he said. "Has there been a formal decision on whether to reopen that analysis?" Rourke looked at him. "That analysis was closed." "I understand. I'm asking whether there's been a formal discussion about the temperature condition question." He kept his voice entirely neutral. "Whitfield was going to pull the verification documentation. I don't know what he found." Whitfield, who was sitting 2 seats down, cleared his throat. "The verification cycles for bands 1 and 5 were run at standard lab conditions," he said. "There's no documented rationale for why the operational temperature differential was excluded from the analysis." The room went quiet in a different way. "Meaning it wasn't a deliberate decision," Dr. Choi said. She was at the far end of the table and she had been listening with the same focused attention she'd brought to Ethan's interview. "Meaning we can't confirm it was," Whitfield said. Torres was already pulling something up on his laptop. "If the band 1 error is actually out of spec, what does that do to the low-altitude guidance performance?" "Depends on the magnitude," Rourke said. He was clearly already running through it in his head. "If the thermal correction produces an error comparable to what we're seeing in the middle bands—" He stopped. He looked at the numbers. That would push the low-altitude guidance accuracy outside the contract parameters. The room absorbed this. "We need to rerun bands 1 and 5, Dr. Choi said. It was not a question. "That's 2 weeks of work minimum," Rourke said. "It's better than delivering a system that doesn't meet spec," she said. Mark looked at Ethan. It was a brief look, not obvious to the rest of the room, but deliberate. Ethan gave the smallest possible nod and looked back at his legal pad. The meeting went for another 40 minutes. It was not harmonious. Torres and Rourke exchanged several more pointed remarks, and at one point Mark had to physically redirect the conversation away from a disagreement about documentation standards that was threatening to consume the remaining time. But it was productive. The action items at the end were specific and assigned, and nobody walked out. Afterward, in the hallway, Mark fell into step beside Ethan. "You sandbagged that in there," Mark said. It was not an accusation. More like an observation from someone who appreciated the technique. "I didn't have a position to back it up from yet," Ethan said. "I can ask questions from anywhere." "Whitfield came to me yesterday," Mark said. "I know." "He said you'd flagged it, and he wanted to know how you'd seen it that fast." "What did you tell him?" I told him to think about it. Mark paused. He's been on this project for 14 months. You'd been here 4 hours. He would have found it eventually, Ethan said. Maybe, Mark said. Or maybe we'd have delivered an out-of-spec system and had a very bad day 6 months from now. He stopped at his office door. You're not what I expected, Carter. People keep saying that, Ethan said. What did you expect people to say? Ethan thought about it. I expected people to tolerate me for a while and then decide. And I think some people are skipping straight to the deciding part, he said, which is fine. I'd rather be evaluated than managed. Mark looked at him for a moment. Keep doing what you're doing, he said, and went into his office. The weeks folded into each other with a rhythm that Ethan hadn't felt in years. The particular rhythm of hard work that was actually connected to something real, the kind that left him tired in a way that had a bottom to it, a specific tiredness rather than the diffuse exhaustion of struggling against nothing in particular. He got to the office early and stayed late. He read documentation on the train. He built a working model, imperfect, partial, constantly being revised, of the error propagation in the Orion 7 guidance system, tracking it through the interaction between the propulsion calibration outputs and the navigation control architecture. He attended every meeting he was eligible to attend and sat in the back of several he wasn't supposed to be in, listening, mapping the communication patterns between teams. He made mistakes. He misread a notation in the propulsion specs on his second week and flagged a problem that turned out to be a known artifact of the test setup, not an actual error, which Torres caught with visible satisfaction. He ran his own verification model for the Band 1 reanalysis and had to throw it out after Rourke pointed out that he'd used an outdated version of the thermal expansion coefficient for the housing material. He accepted both corrections without the defensiveness that would have been fatal to his credibility in this environment and moved forward. The Band 1 and 5 reanalysis, when it came back 3 weeks later, showed exactly what Ethan had suspected. The temperature differential was material. The low-altitude guidance error was outside contract parameters. Not by a catastrophic margin, but by enough that the system as currently calibrated would not pass final acceptance testing, Dr. Choi presented the results in a meeting that included Mark and both teams and was notably quiet during the numbers portion. The room understood the implication. The delivery milestone was 7 months away, and they had just confirmed a fundamental calibration problem that needed to be corrected across the full guidance architecture. How long to fix it? Mark asked. Rourke looked at his team, looked at his notes. If we get unobstructed time on the test rig, maybe 10 weeks. We have competing rig schedule with the Harrison project, Torres said. We'd need to negotiate priority, Rourke said. That goes to Sterling, Mark said. Before anyone escalates to Sterling, Ethan said, and several people looked at him. I want to make sure we're solving the right problem. The temperature correction is necessary. But I think there's also an architecture-level issue in the calibration propagation that the temperature fix alone won't address. Rourke looked at him with the expression of a man whose plate was already full. What architecture issue? Ethan pulled up his laptop and turned it to face the room. He'd been building this analysis for 2 weeks, quietly, in the margins of his assigned work. It was a step-by-step trace of how a calibration correction entered the system at the propulsion level and propagated upward through the navigation control loop. And it showed, at 3 specific points in the chain, where the error was being amplified rather than dampened. The calibration handoff from propulsion to navigation has 3 gain stages, Ethan said. Currently, 2 of them are applying correction factors that were set for the original baseline temperature parameters. When we run the corrected calibration, those gain stages are going to amplify the correction itself in ways that could produce new errors in bands 2 and 3. The silence in the room was of a specific quality. You're saying the fix might break things that currently work, Whitfield said. I'm saying if we implement the temperature correction without also adjusting these 3 gain factors, there's a meaningful probability it does. Ethan looked around the table. I might be wrong. This is my model, not a verified analysis. But before we go to Sterling with a 10-week timeline and a test rig priority request, someone should check whether my model is right. Rourke was already looking at his screen. Torres was looking at Ethan's laptop. Dr. Choi had her glasses off and was holding them with one hand, looking at the projected model with the specific focused attention That meant she was working through the implications. If you're right, she said slowly, the correction approach changes significantly. If I'm right, the correction approach gets more complex, but the outcome is more reliable, Ethan said. If I'm wrong, you lose a day verifying it and the original timeline stands. I'll check it tonight, Rourke said. His voice had lost the adversarial edge it had carried for most of the previous weeks. He said it as a technical professional who had encountered a potentially important problem and needed to evaluate it. That was all. The meeting ended. People filed out. Ethan gathered his laptop and his notes and was heading for the door when he nearly walked into Victoria Sterling. He stopped. She was standing just outside the conference room door, which meant she'd arrived somewhere during the meeting. Early or late, he wasn't sure. She had her arms crossed, not in a closed-off way, but in the way of someone who had been standing in one place listening for a while. You weren't in the meeting, Ethan said. I was in the hallway for the last 15 minutes, she said. He wasn't sure what to say to that. How's your model looking, she said. Rourke is going to verify it tonight. If he confirms it, then we have a more complicated problem than anyone thought we did, and about 4 months to solve it before the delivery milestone becomes genuinely in danger. He paused. That's not what you want to hear. No, she said, but it's what I need to hear, and that's more useful. She looked at him directly. You've been here 6 weeks. Yes. Walk me through how you found the gain stage problem. He did. They stood in the corridor outside the empty conference room, and he explained his reasoning. The trace analysis, the specific points in the propagation chain where the amplification was happening, the modeling choices he'd made, and the assumptions embedded in them, and which of those assumptions he was least confident about. She listened without interrupting, asking 2 questions that were precise and technical and demonstrated clearly that she understood the underlying engineering. He'd known she had an aerospace background. She'd taken over the company at 27 after her father's death, and she'd grown up inside the industry. But he hadn't fully understood until this moment that she wasn't just a business executive who'd inherited a technical company. She actually understood the engineering. You're not just running the company, he said, when she'd asked her second question. I never just run the company, she said. There was something in her voice that was slightly harder on that sentence. A reflex tightening, something personal. He didn't push it. If Rourke confirms the model, she said, returning to the technical problem, I want you in the room when we decide the correction approach, not as an observer. Mark, I'll talk to Mark, she said. This is your analysis. You should be in the room when we work from it. Okay, he said. She started to move and then stopped. How's your daughter? The shift was unexpected enough that it took him a half second. Better, he said. Cleared the infection. She goes to her follow-up appointment next week. You were able to get her to a regular pediatrician? Through the company benefits, yes. He looked at her. The 60-day mark hit last week. Something in her expression shifted. Not dramatically, just a small movement around the eyes that was harder to categorize than her professional affect. Good, she said simply. She walked back down the corridor. But Rourke confirmed the model at 7 the next morning via email. 3 sentences, technically precise. No commentary. The gain stage problem was real. Ethan's analysis was correct. He read the email on the train. He read it twice. He sat with his legal pad on his knee and the city moving past the windows in the gray December morning and let himself feel for a moment the specific weight of what the confirmation meant. Not pride, exactly. He didn't have much energy for pride. More like the particular bodily relief of a man who had put a significant part of himself out in the open and been proven right rather than wrong. He'd been in the industry again for 6 weeks. He was behind on software, still climbing toward current on the specific technical landscape of Sterling's projects, navigating a team dynamic that had years of friction baked into it. He was doing all of this while managing a 6-year-old's recovery, a budget that was still tight in specific ways despite the salary, and the administrative machinery of restarting a career from a standstill. He wasn't ready for any of it. He was doing it anyway. He put his legal pad away and looked out the window. The train went underground. The city disappeared. He sat in the artificial light of the tunnel with Rourke's 3 sentences in his pocket and tried to think clearly about the correction approach they'd need to present to Sterling. He had work to do. He picked up his legal pad again and started writing. Rourke's confirmation email changed the shape of everything. Within 48 hours, the correction approach Ethan had outlined was the center of the project. The question was no longer whether the gain stage problem existed. It existed, verified, documented, now formally part of the project record, but how to solve it without creating new problems in the process, and how to solve it fast enough that the delivery milestone didn't slip a third time. Mark convened a working session the day after Rourke's email. It was a different kind of meeting than the review sessions Ethan had been attending. Smaller, less formal, the people in the room limited to those who were actually going to do the work. Ethan, Rourke, Torres, Whitfield, and a propulsion specialist from Mark's team named Diane Park, who had been largely invisible in the larger meetings, but turned out to know the hardware calibration architecture better than anyone else in the building. They worked from Ethan's model. Rourke had already extended it overnight, filling in the sections Ethan had flagged as uncertain, running the analysis with more precise material parameters. The basic structure held. 3 gain stages in the calibration propagation chain needed to be recalculated, and the correction factors updated, and this had to happen in a specific sequence, because each stage fed the next. The sequencing is the hard part, Diane Park said. She was pointing at the schematic on the whiteboard, her marker tracing the propagation path. If we correct stage 1 without knowing what stage 2 is going to do with the corrected output, we're guessing. We don't have to guess, Ethan said. We model stage 2 before we touch stage 1. Modeling stage 2 correctly requires the actual stage 1 output, not the projected output, Rourke said. Then we run a partial correction on stage 1, enough to get a real output that's approximately right. Model stage 2 from that, then go back and finalize stage 1. That's 2 passes on stage 1, Torres said. He didn't say it critically, just noting the implication. 2 passes on stage 1, 1 pass on stages 2 and 3, Ethan said. 4 total operations instead of 3. It adds maybe a week to the schedule. Or we get stage 1 right the first time and do 3 passes, Torres said. Show me how to get stage 1 right the first time without stage 2 data, Ethan said. Torres opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the whiteboard. Fine, he said. 4 passes. The session ran 3 hours. By the end of it, they had a correction plan that was specific, sequenced, and had enough verification checkpoints that each phase could be confirmed before the next began. It was not elegant. It was the product of 5 engineers arguing in a room until the argument ran out of alternatives. And it had that quality, the roughness of a solution that had been tested against objections before it left the room. Mark stood at the whiteboard at the end and looked at it. This works, he said. It should work, Rourke said. We won't know until we run it. It should work as a significant improvement over where we were last week, Mark said. He looked at the group. I'm taking this to Sterling this afternoon. Anyone who wants their name on the presentation, send me your sections by noon. Everyone except Torres filed out. Torres lingered, and Ethan, who was the last to leave, found him standing at the whiteboard looking at the propagation diagram. You could have taken Rourke's analysis and built this yourself, Torres said. He wasn't looking at Ethan, just at the schematic. You didn't need all of us in here. Yes, I did, Ethan said. Why? Because in 3 months I'll be gone or converted, and this team has to keep working together either way. If I solve problems by myself, the solutions leave when I do. He picked up his laptop bag. The correction plan belongs to this group, not to me. That's why it'll actually get implemented. Torres finally turned and looked at him. He had an expression that was somewhere between skeptical and considering. You think a lot, Torres said. It was not a compliment exactly, but it wasn't an insult. Occupational habit, Ethan said. Victoria received the correction plan in her office at 2 in the afternoon. Mark presented. Ethan was in the room as she'd said he would be, sitting off to the side while Mark walked through the technical approach at the whiteboard she had in the corner of her office. The only piece of furniture in the room that suggested she actually worked there rather than simply occupied it. She asked sharp questions. She pushed back on the timeline estimate, and Mark pushed back on her pushback, and they went 3 rounds on the test rig scheduling before landing on a revised estimate that was 2 days tighter than the working session had projected, which everyone in the room understood was a compromise that would require the team to run longer days in the final verification phase. When Mark finished, she looked at Ethan. "Anything you'd add?" "One thing," Ethan said. "The correction plan is technically sound and I think it'll work. But the reason we got here, the reason the gain stage problem existed for 14 months without being caught, is a process issue. We had two teams working in parallel with incomplete information handoffs. The correction fixes this specific problem. It doesn't fix the process." "Are you proposing a process change?" Victoria said. "I'm noting that the same class of problem could emerge again in the next project if nothing changes," Ethan said. "I don't have a fully formed proposal. I wanted to say it out loud while we're in the room." She studied him. "Put something on paper," she said. "Not urgent. After the correction work is done." He nodded. She looked at Mark. "Give the team what they need on the rig schedule. This takes priority over Harrison." She paused. "Get it done." The correction work ran 11 weeks, which was 2 weeks over the projected estimate, because the world didn't accommodate clean engineering timelines even when everyone was trying. Stage 1 went smoothly. Stage 2 produced an output in the third test cycle that was outside the expected range by a small but non-trivial amount. And it took Rourke and Ethan 3 days working closely together to trace it back to a material property in the housing that had been listed with an incorrect tolerance in the spec documents. An original documentation error from 18 months earlier that had been propagating quietly through every subsequent analysis like a slow leak. When they found it, Rourke sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. 18 months, he said. "It was a small error," Ethan said. "It wouldn't have mattered in most of the operating conditions. But in this one it mattered." "Yes." Rourke was quiet for a moment. He had the particular tiredness of a man who was very good at his job and had still watched something fall through the cracks and had the professional honesty to sit with that rather than deflect it. "How do you find these things?" he said. He asked it without resentment, genuinely. "I read the raw data," Ethan said, "not just the summaries. We all read the raw data." "You read it looking for what should be there," Ethan said. "I read it looking for what doesn't match." Rourke considered this. It was a Tuesday at 8:30 in the evening, and the office was mostly empty, and the two of them were sitting in the glow of 2 monitors with cold coffee cups and a correction plan that needed to be revised again. "Your background at Meridian," Rourke said, "the independent modeling work. That's where you developed this." "That's where I started it," Ethan said. "The last few years I was doing infrastructure work, municipal systems, completely different field. But the approach transfers." "Physical systems have common failure patterns," Ethan said. "The specifics change, the failure modes repeat." Rourke nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee mug, found it empty, set it back down. "I owe you an apology," he said. He said it in the flat, matter-of-fact tone of someone who found apologies uncomfortable, but had a strong enough sense of fairness to deliver them anyway. "For the first few weeks," Rourke continued, "I was not welcoming." "I know," Ethan said. "You'd been here 4 hours and you flagged an error in my analysis that I'd missed. That was—" He stopped. "I took it personally. I shouldn't have." "You took it the way most people would," Ethan said. "It's fine." "It's not particularly fine," Rourke said, "but thank you for not making it worse than it needed to be." They looked at the screen for a moment. The corrected material property was already entered into the model. The revised Stage 2 output would need to be verified against a new test cycle before they could move to Stage 3. 2 more weeks, Rourke said, assessing. "At least," Ethan said. "Mark is not going to love that." "No," Ethan agreed. "But he's going to love a system that passes acceptance testing." The 90th day of Ethan's probationary period arrived on a Thursday, which he noted but didn't particularly mark. The correction work was in its final verification phase. Stage 3 had gone cleanly. The preliminary accuracy numbers from the full system guidance test were inside contract parameters across all 5 altitude bands for the first time in the project's history. There was still work to do. The formal acceptance testing was 6 weeks away. But the structural problem was solved and the team was running well, the 2 months of shared pressure having done more for the integration group's working dynamic than any process intervention could have. He got a calendar invite from Victoria's office for 2 o'clock. He went up to the 22nd floor at 1:58. Janet waved him through without looking up. Victoria was at her desk, not the conference table. This was different from the first meeting. She had 2 folders in front of her, and she gestured at the chair across from her desk. He sat. 90 days, she said. Yes. Do you want me to run through the formal evaluation, or do you want to skip to the part where I tell you you're staying? Something in him settled. He hadn't realized until this moment how much tension he'd been carrying around the uncertainty of this, not consciously, just as background load. You could run the formal version, he said. I'd still like to know what you think. She looked at the folder. You identified a guidance system error that had been present for 14 months. You developed the correction model that became the basis for the fix. You managed a team communication dynamic that had been producing friction for over a year without being given any authority to do so. She looked up. You did all of this while being visibly behind on software platforms and current industry tools, which means the underlying technical instinct was doing the work your current knowledge gaps couldn't do. I'm not that far behind anymore, he said. I know. I've watched you close the gap. She set the folder down. Market rate salary for your experience and contribution level. The number is in the offer letter, which Janet will have for you when you leave. It is not an opening negotiation position. I looked at comparable roles, and I paid above that because I want you to know what I think you're worth, not what the market thinks you're worth. He looked at her. The directness of this, the complete absence of the performance that usually surrounded salary conversations, was disorienting in a way he hadn't expected. Thank you, he said. It came out simpler and more direct than he'd planned. You also mentioned a process proposal, she said. After the correction work. Oh, I have something rough, he said. It's not finished. Bring it when it's ready. She paused. The core idea. What is it? A formal integration review function, he said. Not a new department, just a defined role. Someone whose explicit job is to sit between technical teams and manage information handoffs. Documentation standards for cross-team assumptions. A sign-off requirement before any analysis closes that confirms the adjacent teams have reviewed and agreed to the inputs. He paused. It's not complicated. The problem was never complicated. It was just unmanaged. She was quiet for a moment. How many people would it require? She said. 2 to start. 1 experienced engineer in the role, 1 junior analyst doing the documentation tracking. He'd been thinking about this. If it works, it could be expanded to other divisions. Write it up formally, she said. I want to present it to the division heads. He nodded. Then something made him say, they're not going to like it. They're not going to like a new requirement on their processes, she agreed. That's different from them being wrong. Some of them will push back. I'm aware. They'll say it adds overhead. It does add overhead. Her voice was steady. Everything that prevents failure adds overhead. The question is whether the overhead is worth the failure it prevents. He thought about that. The gain stage problem cost us 2 months, he said. And if it had gone to acceptance testing uncorrected, she said, it would have cost us the contract, $3 million in penalties, and a significant portion of our defense sector credibility. She picked up her pen. Write the proposal, Ethan. He stood to leave. He was at the door when he turned back. I want to go get the ring next week, he said. She looked at him. The 30 days ran out 10 weeks ago. I know. Frank agreed to extend it. He'd called Frank Goldstein twice. Frank had been accommodating in the particular way of a man who had been in the business long enough to know which things were worth waiting for. I have the money now. Something moved across Victoria's expression that was private enough that he felt he was seeing something he wasn't necessarily supposed to see. She looked back at her desk. Good, she said. It was the same word she'd used before, in the corridor after the project meeting. Short, unembellished, but not without weight. He picked up the ring on a Friday afternoon, leaving work at 4:30, the first time he'd left before 6 since starting. Frank retrieved the envelope from the back without ceremony, checked the paperwork, and returned Ethan's $200 storage fee in the form of credit toward a guitar in the window that Ethan had no intention of buying. Cash is fine, Ethan said. Frank counted out the bills. Ethan put the ring on in the shop, standing at the counter. He put it on the same finger it had always lived on, and it fit exactly as it always had, which he'd been half afraid wouldn't be the case. Afraid that some physical change in himself over the last 3 months would have altered even that. But it slid on cleanly and sat the way it had always sat, and he held his hand still for a moment, looking at it. He didn't feel the clean, resolved feeling he'd expected. He felt something more complicated, the specific, layered sensation of an object that carried a lot of history, some of it good, some of it painful, all of it irreplaceable. He felt Maya in a way he hadn't let himself feel in a while. Not the grief version of her, not the hospital version, but the earlier version. The woman who'd laughed at the kitchen table about being $90 short and said it didn't matter. He thought it probably always mattered to carry something like that. He thought you just had to find a way to carry it alongside everything else. Frank was already looking at his phone. "You need a receipt?" Frank said. "No," Ethan said. "I'm good." Outside on West Madison, the December air was doing what December air in Chicago did, which was everything, in unpredictable combinations. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment with his hand in his jacket pocket, the ring warm against his fingers from being worn. He pulled out his phone and called Sophie. She answered on the second ring, which meant she was sitting near the phone waiting for it, which meant Mrs. Kowalski had told her he was going to call. "Did you get it?" she said. "I got it." A sound on her end that was somewhere between a gasp and a satisfied announcement. "Can I see?" "You can see it tonight." "On your finger?" "On my finger," he said. "Good," she said, with the authority of a child who had been keeping track of this situation and was relieved to close the file. "Mrs. Kowalski says, can you bring home the bread from the store on Kedzie, the one with the seeds?" "The seeded rye," he said. "Yes. She wants to make sandwiches." He was walking already, back toward the bus stop. The city was moving in its Friday afternoon way, people released from their buildings and moving with the specific, slightly loosened energy of the week's end. "Tell her I'll get it," he said. "Okay." A pause. "Daddy?" "Yeah." "I'm glad you have a real job." He laughed, and it came out the normal kind this time, not the slightly unsteady kind, not the kind that had other things underneath it, just laughing. "Me too, Bug," he said. "Me too." He hung up and kept walking, turning the proposal over in his mind. The integration review function, the documentation standards, the formal cross-team sign-off requirement that he'd been sketching on his legal pad for 6 weeks. He thought about how to write it in a way that made the overhead argument difficult to make. He thought about which division heads would push back hardest and what their specific objections would be, and how to address those objections before they were raised. He thought about what Victoria had said, that everything worth protecting costs something. He turned on to Kedzie and found the bakery and bought the seeded rye. He held it under his arm on the bus and felt the ring on his finger and watched the city go past outside the window and thought about the proposal and about Sophie and about the fact that 4 months ago he had stood at a pawn shop counter with $3 in his wallet and understood with complete certainty that he had run out of road. He had been wrong about that. He'd been wrong about a lot of things, it turned out. The road had not ended. It had simply made a turn that he couldn't see from where he was standing. He held on to the overhead rail as the bus lurched forward at a light. The bread under his arm, the ring on his finger, the proposal half written in his head, going home. The integration review proposal took Ethan 3 weeks to write properly. Not because the ideas were complicated. He'd had the core of it mapped out since the Orion 7 correction phase, but because he understood intuitively that a proposal like this would be evaluated not just on its technical merits, but on the quality of its argument, and the argument needed to be airtight before it went in front of people whose instinct would be to find the holes. He wrote it, rewrote it, showed it to Mark, who suggested 4 changes, 2 of which Ethan accepted and 2 of which he pushed back on in 1. He showed it to Rourke, who read it silently for 20 minutes at his desk, and then looked up and said it was the right idea, poorly titled, and suggested calling it Cross-Team Integration Protocol instead of Integration Review Function, which Ethan agreed was better. He showed it to Dr. Choi, who made no suggestions at all but told him to include the cost-benefit calculation more prominently, because in her experience the only thing that changed institutional behavior faster than a good argument was a good argument with numbers attached. He gave the final version to Victoria on a Tuesday morning in January, a plain printed document in a folder. No presentation, no staged walkthrough. He set it on her desk and said he thought it was ready. She read it that afternoon. She called him up at 4:30 and said two things: that she agreed with the structure, and that she was going to present it to the division heads on Friday, and he should be in the room. "You sure?" he said. "You wrote it," she said. "You should be there to answer the questions. I can't." The Friday meeting was in the large conference room on the 22nd floor, the one with the view of the river that was currently gray and carrying small ice formations. 7 division heads around the table, ages ranging from late 30s to early 60s, all of them experienced enough in the industry to have formed strong opinions about operational process, and all of them, as Ethan had predicted, initially resistant. The pushback started in the first 10 minutes. The division head who led the systems engineering group was a man named Gerald Fitch, silver-haired and precise, who had been at Sterling since the early years and carried a certain authority in these rooms by virtue of longevity. He read the proposal with a visible tension in his jaw, and when Victoria finished her opening summary, he went first. "This adds a mandatory review checkpoint to every cross-team analysis submission," Fitch said. "We're currently managing 4 active projects simultaneously. Adding checkpoint overhead to every cross-team handoff is going to slow production cycles across the board." "By how much?" Victoria said. "I'd estimate 15% on the documentation cycle." "Against what risk reduction?" Ethan said. Fitch looked at him with the specific expression of a man who had not expected to be directly addressed by someone he'd been introduced to 20 minutes ago. "That's speculative," Fitch said. "The Orion 7 gain stage problem was 14 months of undetected error in a primary guidance system," Ethan said. He kept his voice even. "The detection and correction phase cost 11 weeks and delayed the delivery milestone. The financial exposure, if it had reached acceptance testing uncorrected, was in the range of $3 million in contractual penalties." He looked around the table. "I'm not saying every cross-team documentation gap produces a problem of that scale. I'm saying the one we just lived through did, and the gap that caused it was structural, not individual. The same structure is operating across all 4 of your active projects right now." A silence. "How many active cross-team analysis exchanges happen in a typical month across the division?" Ethan continued. Fitch looked slightly wrong-footed. "I'd have to check." "I pulled the project logs," Ethan said. He'd done this 2 weeks earlier. Across all 4 active projects, there are approximately 32 formal cross-team analysis handoffs per month. The protocol I'm proposing adds a structured sign-off requirement that takes, by my estimate, 45 minutes per handoff to execute properly. He paused. "That's 24 hours of overhead per month across the entire division." "Per month?" said the head of the propulsion division, a woman named Carla Metz who had been listening without speaking. She was doing the math visibly. "Against the 11 weeks we just spent correcting a problem that a 45-minute sign-off review would have caught in month 2 of the Orion 7 project," Ethan said. The room was doing arithmetic. Fitch looked at his copy of the proposal. "The protocol requires a senior engineer in the integration review role. That's a headcount addition." "1 senior engineer and 1 junior analyst to start," Ethan said. "I've included the compensation range in the appendix. Against the cost exposure reduction, the break-even on the headcount investment is approximately 8 months at current project volume." "You've modeled this," Carla Metz said. "Yes." "Show me the model." Ethan pulled up his laptop and turned it to face the table. He walked them through it. The failure probability estimates, the cost per failure calculation based on actual Orion 7 data, the headcount cost, the timeline to break even, the sensitivity analysis showing how the calculation changed if failure frequency was lower or higher than the base estimate. It was 40 minutes of detailed back and forth, the kind of meeting where nothing was resolved without being tested from multiple angles. And Ethan answered what he could answer and said, "I don't know," to the things he didn't know, and didn't try to fill gaps with confident-sounding speculation. By the end, Fitch had moved from resistant to grudging. Carla Metz was actively supportive. 3 of the other division heads were engaged enough to be asking implementation questions rather than objections. One was still skeptical and said so plainly, which Ethan respected more than the polite neutrality of the others. Victoria let the discussion run until it had run its course. Then she said simply that she was moving forward with a pilot program in the propulsion and guidance divisions, running for 6 months, with a formal evaluation at the end. If the evaluation supported expansion, it would expand. If it didn't, they'd learn from the data and adjust. Who runs the pilot? Fitch asked. Carter, Victoria said. She didn't look at Ethan when she said it, just at the table. Ethan didn't say anything. Carter has been here 4 months, Fitch said, not offensively, just as a fact to be addressed. Carter identified the problem that created this proposal, Victoria said. He wrote the proposal. He modeled the financials and defended them in this room. She looked at Fitch. I'm open to the argument that seniority should override that. Make the argument. Fitch was quiet for a moment. Fine, he said. The pilot program launched in February and ran into immediate friction, which was expected, and then threw the friction into something that started to resemble a functioning system, which was less expected in its speed. The friction came from the documentation requirement primarily. Engineers who had been submitting analysis handoffs through informal channels, emails, shared drives, verbal confirmations in hallways, resisted the formalized sign-off process the way anyone resists having to slow down and write down what they're doing. There were complaints. There were 2 instances of teams attempting to route around the protocol by reclassifying cross-team work as internal reviews. Ethan caught both, addressed them directly and without drama, and adjusted the protocol language to close the classification gap. He hired the junior analyst first, a recent graduate named Kim Young-soo, sharp and detail-oriented, with the particular combination of patience and precision that documentation work required. He gave Kim the tracking system to manage and spent 2 weeks training her until she could run it without him, because a protocol that lived in one person's head was a protocol that would break the moment that person left the room. The senior engineer role was harder to fill. He interviewed 6 people. 5 of them were technically competent, and none of them had the specific communication ability the role required. The capacity to sit in 2 different technical cultures simultaneously without becoming an advocate for either one. He knew what he was looking for because he'd been doing the job himself, and he knew what made it work. It wasn't about being the smartest person in the room, it was about being the most attentive listener and the most precise translator. He found it in the 7th interview. The candidate was a woman named Patricia Ruiz, 43, who'd spent 12 years in manufacturing quality assurance before moving to aerospace. She had an unusual background for the role, not a pure research engineer, but the QA work had given her exactly the cross-domain observation skills the position needed. She also had a manner in the interview that Ethan recognized. The manner of someone who had been underestimated professionally and had developed, over time, a very precise way of making herself impossible to dismiss. He hired her on a Thursday. She started the following Monday and understood the documentation system in 3 days. The Orion 7 acceptance testing happened in March. The system passed on the first cycle across all 5 altitude bands, the guidance accuracy inside contract parameters with margin to spare. The Defense Program Office sent a formal letter of commendation, which was unusual enough that it got mentioned in Sterling's internal communication to the full staff. Mark Okafor found Ethan in the break room the morning after the letter was distributed. "You know what that letter means," Mark said. "The Harrison contract review next quarter," Ethan said. "They're going to want us on the next platform program. Bigger scope, better terms." Mark poured himself coffee. "And they asked specifically about the team that ran the correction work." "Rourke ran the correction work," Ethan said. "Rourke was the analyst lead. You were the one who found the problem." Mark looked at him. "Don't be falsely modest. It doesn't suit you, and it's not accurate." Ethan was quiet. "Victoria told me about the proposal," Mark said. "The pilot results so far. It's 2 months in, too early to draw conclusions. 2 months in and we caught a cross-team assumption mismatch in the Harrison project before it became a problem," Mark said. "Patricia Ruiz flagged it in the sign-off review. I checked. It would have been another documentation gap running invisibly for who knows how long." He set down his coffee cup. "That's the protocol working." Ethan stood at the counter with his own coffee. The break room was empty except for the 2 of them, the mid-morning quiet of a workday in its groove. "I want to ask you something," Mark said. "Okay." "When you came in, the probationary thing, the way you got here, The team wasn't welcoming. I know. I wasn't either, initially. I thought Victoria was making a judgment call that was more personal than professional. He paused. I want you to know I was wrong about that. Ethan looked at him. Mark had the expression of a man who delivered assessments directly because he thought indirect delivery was a form of dishonesty, and who extended that standard to assessments of himself. She was making both, Ethan said. She made a personal judgment about whether something was there. She let the technical evaluation confirm whether she was right. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Mark considered this. No, he said. I suppose they're not. They stood in the break room in the particular companionable quiet of two people who had worked through something together and come out the other side of it with a different understanding of each other than they'd started with. You're not going to be in the integration review function forever, Mark said. Just so you know. I'm aware. I'm putting you forward for the Harrison program lead role when the scope is confirmed. He looked at Ethan. If you want it, what does it involve? Technical lead on the guidance systems integration for the new platform. Larger team, more responsibility, more pressure. He paused. You'd be a full member of the project leadership group, reporting directly to me. Ethan thought about the first day. The chair that wasn't there, the credential access that took 2 hours to activate, the way nobody had looked up from their computers when he'd arrived. Yes, he said. I want it. Sophie turned 7 in April. The birthday was a production in the particular way of a 7-year-old's birthday, which meant a specific requested cake flavor that changed 3 times in the week leading up to it, a precise list of which friends were invited that went through 2 revisions, and a level of advanced planning and discussion that would have been appropriate for a state dinner. The final form of the celebration was a Saturday afternoon party at a community center gymnasium near Logan Square. 12 children running in various directions, a chocolate cake with green frosting that was exactly the right shade of tree green, and Mrs. Kowalski in a folding chair near the door looking pleased with everything. Ethan stood at the edge of the gymnasium and watched Sophie open presents with the focused intensity she brought to all important activities. She had grown 2 inches since November, and the fever that had sent him to the pawn shop seemed from this distance impossibly remote. A different chapter, a different version of the same life. She had a regular pediatrician now. Dr. Angela Torres, a pediatric specialist on the North Side, who'd been recommended by the Sterling Benefits Coordinator, who had done a full workup and said that Sophie was healthy, that the recurring respiratory infections appeared to be related to a mild asthma predisposition that was entirely manageable, and that with the right preventative care, there was no reason to expect ongoing problems. She'd prescribed a maintenance inhaler and given Ethan a detailed action plan for early intervention symptoms, and he'd left her office feeling the specific relief of having a real answer. Not a reassuring maybe, but an actual clinical picture with a management strategy. He watched Sophie hold up a book someone had given her, a chapter book, something with a dragon on the cover, and inspect it with the critical appraisal of someone who had opinions about books. She looked up, scanning the room, found him at the edge of the gymnasium, and held it up to show him. He gave her a thumbs up. She went back to the presents. He'd been standing there about 20 minutes when he heard the door behind him and turned. Victoria was in the doorway, holding a wrapped present and looking slightly uncertain about whether she was in the right place, which was such a departure from her usual complete certainty about everything that it made him genuinely surprised. He'd invited her 3 weeks earlier, in the hallway after a project meeting, on an impulse that he'd almost immediately questioned. He'd said something like, "My daughter's birthday is in April. I don't know if this is appropriate." And she'd said what day, and he'd told her, and she'd written it in her phone. He'd assumed that was a polite acknowledgement rather than an acceptance. "You came," he said. "I said I might," she said, which was not quite what she'd said, but he didn't correct it. "She's the one with the green frosting on her face," he said. Victoria looked across the gymnasium. Sophie was now demonstrating something to the friend next to her with the energy of a person who had recently discovered that explaining things was a power. "She looks like you," Victoria said. "She looks like her mother," he said. A brief pause. Not uncomfortable, just the natural settling of a sentence that had landed with a bit of weight. "Is there a place to put this?" Victoria said, holding up the present. He showed her the table, and she added the present to the pile, and they stood together at the edge of the gymnasium, watching 12 children in various states of sugar-induced acceleration. "This is not something I do often," she said. "Which part?" "Any of it." She had her hands in her pockets, and she was watching Sophie with an expression that was thoughtful and slightly unguarded, in a way her professional face rarely was. "I don't have—" She stopped, started differently. "My father died when I was 25. I'd been in the company since I was 18, working under him, and when he died, the transition was fast. There wasn't really a period of deciding what kind of life I was building. The company was the life, I just moved into it." He didn't say anything. He sensed this was not a thing she said often, and that adding to it would interrupt it. "I'm good at the work," she said. "That's not false modesty in reverse. I'm genuinely good at what I do, and I find it meaningful. But sometimes I look at something like this," she gestured slightly at the gymnasium in general, "and I think about what I traded." "You didn't have to trade it permanently," he said. She looked at him. The directness of her gaze was unchanged. That was always there, the quality of someone who looked at you without flinching from what she saw. But there was something underneath it today that was less defended than usual. "No," she said. "I suppose not." Across the gymnasium, Sophie had finished the presents and was now engaged in some kind of argument with another child about the rules of a game that appeared to be partly invented. Her voice carried across the room at full volume. Ethan watched her with the fond exasperation of a father who had long since accepted that his daughter would always be the loudest person in any room and had decided this was a feature rather than a problem. "She got that from you," Victoria said. "The volume?" "The certainty," she said. "The way she stands when she's making an argument." He looked at Sophie. She was standing with her weight on one foot, gesturing with both hands, holding her position without hesitation. He'd never seen it from the outside before. "Maybe," he said. The pilot program evaluation came in at the end of April. Patricia Ruiz and Kim Young-soo had built a tracking system that was now logging every cross-team handoff in the 2 participating divisions, and the data told a clear story. In the 5 months of the pilot, the protocol had flagged 11 cross-team assumption discrepancies before they were embedded in the project record. Of those 11, Patricia's assessment was that 3 were minor and would likely have been caught in normal review cycles. 4 were moderate, the kind that would have cost a week to a month of rework, and 4 were significant enough that they might have produced problems comparable in scale to the Orion 7 gain stage issue. Ethan put the evaluation in a report and gave it to Victoria. He didn't editorialize. The data was the argument. She presented it to the full division heads meeting at the end of April. Fitch was not enthusiastic, but his objections had shifted from the protocol itself to its implementation scale, which was a different conversation. A practical argument rather than a philosophical one, and practical arguments had practical solutions. By the end of May, the protocol had been approved for full expansion across all active projects. It was not a triumph in any cinematic sense. There were no announcements, no formal acknowledgement, no moment of visible victory. The division heads moved on to the next agenda item. The expansion would happen over the next quarter, managed by Patricia and Kim with Ethan's oversight, and in 12 months, most of the engineers who dealt with it daily probably wouldn't remember a time before it existed. That was how real change worked. It didn't announce itself. It just became the new condition. Yes, Ethan was named lead engineer on the Harrison Platform program in June. The formal announcement went out on a Tuesday morning, 2 paragraphs in the internal newsletter, and by the afternoon his calendar had 12 meeting requests on it, and Torres had appeared at his desk with what turned out to be, beneath the professional surface, something resembling congratulations. "You're going to have to manage Rourke," Torres said. "I know." "He doesn't like being managed." "Neither do you," Ethan said. "Neither do I. That's not actually an obstacle." Torres looked at him with the expression he'd been wearing since about month 2, the one that had evolved from skeptical to reluctant to admit it. "You know what annoys me most about you?" he said. "I have some guesses." "You're almost always right and you're not smug about it," Torres said. "It makes it really hard to be annoyed." "I'm wrong regularly," Ethan said. "You were right about the stage 2 approach in week 8. I was right about that, Torres said, with the emphasis of someone who had been waiting for this acknowledgement. You were right about that, Ethan confirmed. Torres nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to his desk. In July, 8 months after his first day, Ethan moved to a larger apartment, still Logan Square, still a six-flat, but a floor up and facing east instead of north, which meant morning light instead of the permanent gray of the north-facing rooms. Sophie approved the new apartment primarily on the basis of the closet in her room, which was large enough to also be, as she explained, a reading area, and had spent the first weekend after the move arranging it with a level of seriousness that confirmed this was a significant decision. He put up Sophie's bookshelves first, the purple one and a new one he'd bought at the furniture store on North Avenue, and he put together her bed, and he hung the drawing she'd made of their old apartment as a kind of farewell to it. A crayon drawing, oddly accurate in its proportions, that showed the kitchen and the backyard maple and a small figure he assumed was him standing at the sink. When he asked her why she'd drawn him at the sink, she said, "Because that's where you always were." He thought about that. He thought about all the evenings he'd stood at that sink looking out at the November gray maple, trying to think clearly about what came next. He thought about how much of the last year had been spent in the specific mental space of the man standing at the sink, calculating, managing, trying to hold things together by force of will and insufficient resources. He thought about how that version of himself had become so dominant that he'd almost forgotten there was another version, the one that could go into a room with a complex technical problem and come out with something no one else had seen. He didn't miss the sink, but he understood, standing here in the new apartment with Sophie's crayon portrait in his hands, that the man at the sink was part of who he was now. The years of managing the impossible, the medical bills and the overdue rent and the Sophie logistics and the grief that never fully went away but had to be carried alongside everything else, that had done something to him. Not just damage, though there had been damage. It had also built something, a specific kind of attention, a tolerance for ambiguity and complexity and imperfect information, an ability to stay functional under pressure because the alternative, for years, had been unthinkable. He hung the drawing on Sophie's wall next to the window. Victoria called him in August for a reason unrelated to work. This was unusual enough that he registered it before she'd gotten 3 sentences in. She was calling to say that she was restructuring the executive leadership team, and she wanted him to know before the announcement went public. His role was expanding, no longer just the integration review program and the Harrison project lead, but a formal position in the technical leadership structure with a seat at the table for strategic decisions about project acquisition and technical direction. Director of Integration Systems, she said. It's a new title. I created it because the existing titles didn't describe what the function is. He was quiet for a moment. That's a significant change, he said. It's the role you've been doing for 8 months, she said. The title is catching up to the reality. I'm not going to argue, he said. Good. A pause. There's a board presentation in September, quarterly review. I want you there. For the integration program results? For that, she said. And because I want the board to know who runs the technical foundation of this company's project delivery. He didn't say anything for a moment. Victoria, he said. Yes. I want to say something, and I'm not sure how to say it without it sounding like something it isn't. Say it anyway. He thought about the pawn shop, about standing at that counter with the ring on the glass and the word okay in his mouth and the specific internal effort of not letting his face show what was happening. He thought about the business card, about calling her from the bus stop on Division Street with Sophie holding his hand in the cold. Whatever you saw in that shop, he said, I want you to know it was real, not performance. I wasn't holding it together. I was just holding on. A silence on the line. I know, she said. Her voice was a degree quieter than usual. I'm saying it because I think you made a call that went against what was obvious and safe, and I want you to know that I understand what that cost. He paused. And I want you to know that the thing you saw, whatever it was, it didn't disappear when things got better. I didn't become a different person. I just got the room to be the person I already was. A longer silence. That's what I saw, she said finally. Not potential in the abstract. The specific person who was already there. He sat in his office in the fading August afternoon with the phone against his ear and the city outside doing what it did. Endless, indifferent, full of people standing at their own counters with their own rings and their own $3 and their own version of the word okay. And he thought about what it meant to be seen accurately by another person. Not charitably, accurately, without the distortion of pity or the distortion of expectation, just seen. "Thank you," he said. It was the same two words he'd said in her office in December, but they meant something slightly different now, or the same thing more completely. "Stop thanking me," she said, and he could hear something that wasn't quite a laugh but was adjacent to one. "You've thanked me enough." The board presentation in September was in a room on the 22nd floor that Ethan had not been in before. Larger than the executive conference room, with a view in 3 directions and a table that sat 20. The board members arrived in the particular way of people who were accustomed to being the most powerful people in most rooms, with the particular manner of people who did not need to demonstrate this because it was assumed. Ethan had prepared his section carefully. He wasn't nervous in the way he'd expected to be. He was something closer to focused, the same kind of focus he'd found in technical problems, the place where the complexity narrowed down to what was actually being asked and everything else fell away. He presented the integration protocol results. The data was direct and clear. The pilot and expansion had logged 43 flag discrepancies in 11 months, of which the technical assessment identified 12 as having significant failure potential if unaddressed. The estimated cost exposure reduction across those 12 issues, modeled conservatively, was in the range of $7 to $9 million. The program cost, headcount, infrastructure, overhead, was $340,000 for the year. One of the board members, a man in his 60s named Hargrove, who had the particular precision of someone who had spent his career reading numbers, looked at the figures and then at Ethan. "These projections are your models?" Hargrove said. "Yes, the methodology is in the appendix. I'd welcome any critique of the assumptions." "You're being conservative." "Deliberately," Ethan said. "Why?" "Because I'd rather prove the case with underestimates and be right than prove it with optimistic projections and be questioned later." He paused. "The actual value is likely higher. I'd rather you decide based on the conservative case." Hargrove looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who had been in many meetings and recognized when someone was doing something unusual. "Continue," he said. Afterward, in the corridor outside the boardroom, Victoria fell into step beside him. The board had approved the integration protocol for permanent institutional status, with a budget line and formal reporting structure. This was the thing that made it real. Not a pilot, not a program, not an initiative that could be dissolved by the next management cycle. An embedded function with a mandate. "Hargrove liked you," Victoria said. "He liked the numbers," Ethan said. "He liked that you didn't oversell them." She glanced at him. "He oversells constantly. He recognizes when someone doesn't." They walked down the corridor toward the elevator. The building was quieter at 5:30 than it had been all day, the particular late afternoon quiet of a place that had done its work and was winding toward the end. "What happens now?" Ethan said. "You mean with the Harrison project, or—" "I mean in general," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "We build the next thing," she said. "That's always what happens." It was a simple answer, maybe the simplest she'd ever given him, but it had the quality of something she actually believed rather than something she was performing, and he thought about it for the rest of the ride down in the elevator and through the lobby and out onto the street where September had turned the air just slightly. Not winter, not yet, but the first suggestion of it, the season turning on its axis the way it always did, whether you were ready or not. He thought about what it meant to build the next thing. He thought about how a year ago he hadn't been able to see 3 days ahead, let alone to the concept of the next thing. He thought about Sophie in her closet reading area, and Mrs. Kowalski's sandwiches, and the ring on his finger, and Rourke's careful 3-sentence email, and Torres being annoyed that Ethan wouldn't give him anything to be more annoyed about. He thought about Patricia Ruiz and Kim Young-soo and the tracking system that was logging, right now, somewhere in the building above him, the cross-team handoffs of 4 active projects, catching the small things before they became large things, doing quietly and without drama the work that prevented the next 11-week correction cycle. He thought about Maya. He thought about her the way he'd learned to think about her. Not with the old grief weight that had made it hard to breathe, but with a kind of directness that was its own form of respect. She'd known who he was, the working version of him, the version that came alive inside complicated problems. She'd known it before he'd fully known it himself. He thought she would have liked to see this year. He thought she would have had pointed observations about every single person in it, most of them accurate. He walked north on Walker toward the train station. The city was doing its evening thing, the rush and the noise, and the million individual urgencies moving in parallel. He passed a woman on her phone arguing with someone about something that sounded important. He passed a man sitting on a bench with his shoes off, and his eyes closed, and his face turned up to the last of the September sun. He passed two kids arguing about something while walking, their argument fully absorbed into the larger noise of the street without slowing their pace at all. He thought about the thing Victoria had said, about being seen, about what it meant when someone looked at you at the worst moment of your life and saw not the worst moment, but the person inside it. He didn't think that was a common thing. He didn't think you could count on it happening or plan for it or manufacture the conditions that made it possible. He thought it was the kind of thing that happened or didn't happen, and what you did with it when it happened was entirely your own. What he'd done with it was go back to work. That was maybe the least romantic way to describe it, but it was the accurate one. He'd taken the card and made the call and walked into the building and sat in the conference room and read the technical documents and asked the questions and done the work. Not gracefully, not without mistakes. With a lot of late nights and a fair amount of doubt, and several moments of standing in the break room at 8 in the evening, wondering if the gap was closing fast enough. The ring caught the last of the September light as he raised his hand to flag the crosswalk. He looked at it. He thought about the envelope in Frank Goldstein's drawer and the $85 and the word OK spoken in the particular flat voice of a man using all available energy on not breaking. He thought, you don't have to be unbreakable. You just have to not break before you find the next solid thing to stand on. Sophie was at home. Mrs. Kowalski was making something that had smelled when he'd left that morning like it was going to be very good. His legal pad was on his desk with the next project's first technical questions already accumulating in the margins, and tomorrow morning he would be on the train reading documentation before 7, and the work would continue in its relentless way, demanding and real and entirely worth doing. He crossed the street. He went home.